I keep it up here just in case. All right. Seeing if this flips over. My freaking browser does not want to do this. Awesome. Got it. All right. Muted there. Yes, Silver, you are in the right place. Hello, everybody. Today we are doing an interview with the eminent Timo Burnham. He is the author of the recent work, Dawn of the Black Sun. And since we're getting started on that, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your most recent work?
About myself, I am Timo. Um,
I always
uh,
get that wrong.
in what way?
Oh, who's got an echo? Sorry. No, I
Uh,
always call you Timo because that's all I have always seen it. But please continue.
do we have an echo?
If we have an echo, I'll try to fix it on my end. But you can go ahead and keep with your explanation. I'll try to fix it
All
on
right.
the technical side.
Yeah. Well, it is Timo, like Tim O. Hey, Vlad. Um, yeah, I am a dude who writes books, um, among other things. But I think you're here for my books. Um, I to be honest, I didn't really think I would ever be writing my own books like 10 years ago. I've never really considered myself good or even like average at writing. Um, Although I did read a lot just for fun.
Well, that's where we all start, isn't it?
Yeah. And I probably am less confident in my own abilities because I compare myself to my older sister and my mom, who are like genius level when it comes to English, like writing, literature, grammar, spelling, all that stuff. And so I'm probably a little bit better than I think, but I just compare myself to them, and so I feel like very inadequate by comparison.
Well, I'll give you credit. You're doing better than most of the major YouTubers I've read because your story kept me engaged all the way to the end. So tell us a little bit about what your story is about and possibly what inspired it.
Um, so the main part of the story is about a boy named Ryushu, or Ryu as he usually goes by.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's about him making a journey up to a mountain, um, which is kind of the first step in a bigger journey, which will require me to finish more books before you get to see that.
Right.
Um, and it's also about him sort of, uh, we'll just say, learning about the magic of the world, and uh, he doesn't learn a lot about how it works exactly, but he does kind of learn to use it a little bit.
Mm-hmm. I,
Um,
I do remember that the magic in your world, or at least the key portion, is referred to as Hio. Is that
yeah.
actually inspired by Ki, or is there something else in folklore that you took that from?
Um, the inspiration, I think, at the very beginning was the I don't know. I know it comes from somewhere. It might be like Greek, ancient Greek philosophy or something, but the idea that your breath was kind of your life force.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that was the original inspiration, and so the word "hyo," um, I kind of I think about the pronunciation as you almost like breathing out sort of forcefully, so like going "hyo" like that,
Yeah.
almost like the Dovahkiin shouts kind of thing.
Oh, now we're getting into Skyrim.
Yep. Um, so I think that was kind of the initial inspiration, and then once I put together like the way the magic works, and when that's also tied into like big mysteries about the world and the world building, then it took on more of a specific role within that because it has to serve a certain function
So I got a
to make
lot of
sense.
I got a lot of that you had some inspiration from some other sources like some old kung fu movies or maybe some other sources. What were some of the things that inspired you to make this particular work?
Um, let's see. Yeah, definitely like kung fu movies, like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think there's definitely some Jackie Chan influence in a couple of the fight scenes. Um, I don't know where specifically. It's kind of hard for me to think about it with fight scenes exactly where, because that's like the one part of writing that comes really naturally to me, like being able to just instantly like choreograph and write down a fight scene without hardly any preparation.
Now, that is something I did want to ask you about because I know a lot of other authors I've talked to have problems with choreographing fight scenes, and action scenes are one of the most difficult parts of writing. How do you handle action scenes?
Um, do you mean like how do I like think about them in terms of like the plot, or just how do I like write an action scene that I already
How
know is going somewhere?
What's your process from the rough draft to the final draft on making an action scene?
Um,
And you could break it down to the monotonous, to the minutia of things that
yeah,
we do.
I
Most of us are writers here.
yeah, like I said, I mean, they come pretty naturally, so I don't think I do change them too much. If I
Hmm.
change from like the first draft to the final draft, it's usually making actions more clear. Like there might be a portion of the fight that like is confusing. Like I didn't make it clear what's actually happening, and readers get confused. And so I will try to make that more clear. Um, Sometimes I will change a part of it, but that would probably be because either I decided the outcome is different, or um, I wanted it to maybe achieve a different emotion than it was.
Hmm.
And so I might probably in that case, you're usually changing like the end or the second half of a fight.
Now
Um,
we did a bit of a collaboration. I know you like to plan a bit. Do you plan out these fights extensively, or do you just kind of let them flow?
Usually I let them flow, because I've got like an outline for the story. I know usually like, okay, there's a fight scene that's going to be here and I haven't gotten to it yet, but then my brain is usually kind of thinking like a little bit about it, um, and then I get to it and I know like, okay, here's the combatants, here's the arena or whatever the environment is they're fighting in, and then here's the outcome, and I have those things, and then I basically just almost try to imagine myself watching it and just writing it down. And that, like I said, with fight scenes, that's the only time that I actually can do that. Like I can just sort of just let it randomly like kind of appear in my mind, and
Hmm.
it works. Like with the rest of writing, I have to try really hard to write it all down. Um, and yeah, so and then sometimes I guess every once in a while I'll write the fight scene, and then I'll be like, you know what, I can change this part here, and it will just make the fight scene cooler, and I'm going to do that.
Well, you can't rule out the rule of cool. I
Yeah.
know a lot of people have trouble with fight scenes. If you were going to give advice to new authors on how to do a fight scene, what would you tell them?
So my advice, I uh, I guess, yeah, two pieces of advice that I would give and that I try to follow is one, um, to have some kind of emotional investment in the fight scene. So if some sort of thing that's going to happen if the character loses, potentially something that might happen if they win. Um, that's going to help a lot with reader engagement, because even if you just write a random, really cool fight scene, but you have no idea who the characters are, you're not going to be super invested as a random person reading it. Um, the other bit of advice is try to have motion in the fight. And the motion, what I mean by motion is not like physical motion of the characters, it's motion of the who's winning and who's losing.
Right.
So if you have a big fight and you're just describing these two characters punching and kicking and punching and kicking and punching and kicking, like that's gonna get boring real fast. Even if like maybe you were watching a film version, it would look cool. But in a book, it generally just gets boring. But if you have this motion where it's like character one starts off and they're winning and they're pushing the other character back, 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 and then all of a sudden it switches and character two changes fighting styles and now he's winning and character one is losing and he's struggling, right?
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly it's way more engaging to the reader.
So I take it you've watched quite a few kung fu movies. Because I feel a lot of inspiration for this book probably came from a number of the fights that I've seen in some movies like Drunken Master and maybe a little bit of Ip Man in there.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm like a connoisseur of like kung fu movies, but I have watched, my share of them. For whatever reason, my brain like remembers like a fight scene I watched like 15 years ago, like way better than any other part of that movie. And so I just have like in my head, I can recall like the choreography,
Mm-hmm.
even though I can't really remember much else about the movie.
So do you have experience fighting yourself?
I've done a little bit of like stuntman training, which is where you basically choreograph fights and you practice them, usually like in a gymnastics gym where you can fall on mats and stuff like that.
Right.
I've done a little bit of that, and then I've done flippies, as Danica's saying, which is like a mixture of gymnastics and martial arts, like the very flashy martial arts like karate and taekwondo.
Right. The showmanship stuff.
Yeah, so lots of spinning kicks, lots of jumping, lots of flipping. Yeah, all that stuff. So
now, how would you compare this, like the more flashy stuff, to being in like a real fight?
You don't do the flashy stuff in a real fight, basically. I mean, I guess you could try. You probably would not succeed.
Well, there could be something to be said for showing tough rather than actually being tough if you don't actually have the being tough.
Yeah, true.
So let's get into some of the not so flashy stuff. Let's get into that opening of that book, because the opening on your book really grabbed me. It was fairly dark. It's probably one of the darker openings I've read in a book. What inspired you to make it just so grabbing, such emotionally punchy?
I think so. With my previous book, I felt like I could have done a better job really like getting the reader invested from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was like always in my head as I was like coming to my next book I was going to write, and as something I wanted to do better. And so I was like, okay, I know I want some kind of very like it doesn't have to be horrible. In this case, it is pretty horrible what
Mm-hmm.
happens. But I wanted something that would really, hopefully, get the reader to feel bad and to feel invested in the main character.
Oh, I felt really, really bad when they drug his girlfriend off. I'm like, oh no, they aren't going to do this to this poor kid. Oh no. It did grip me.
Yeah, so I definitely worked the most like in the editing process on that beginning.
Mm-hmm.
I not because I didn't want the rest of the book to be good, but I really wanted that beginning to be powerful, basically. And I worked to not make it too. I didn't want to give the wrong impression and maybe I still gave the wrong impression, but I tried not to make it too completely dark. So I don't really describe certain things and I don't use certain words. And it's from his perspective, and he's like on the cusp of adulthood. So he doesn't, I mean, he does understand, but he's kind of innocent at that point.
Well, you have to give the poor guy motivation to do what he's about to do. And it seems like what he's going into is fairly brutal. Now, it doesn't go fully into detail about what he's going to do. But just to give us a slight sneak peek, how hard is what Ryu's going to go through going to be?
You're talking about like after the first book, or
Yeah, after the first book, when he finally starts to do his real training, like the actual martial arts he's going to have to go through.
I mean, it's tough, but luckily he is kind of built for gritting his teeth and getting through it.
Mm-hmm.
He's going to have to deal with. I guess this is a very slight spoiler for the end of book 2, but you guys will forget it by the time you read. Something is going to happen to them at the end of book 2 that's going to be really tough to deal with. And he's going to be dealing with that for quite a ways into book 3.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think what he deals with at the beginning of book 1 is very emotionally hard. What he's going to deal with at the end of book 2 is very physically hard to deal with. So
I did want to ask you about something else. So in reading this book, I did have a slight issue with power scaling, but you have multiple power vectors, let's say, different levels that somebody can be powerful, like on a spiritual level, on a martial level. What are your feelings on power scaling in, I don't want to call this shonen, but in a fight series where you're going to have people conflicting with each other? How do you feel power scaling is best handled?
I mean, I think it's kind of the boring answer, but you want a roughly like linear amount of growth. Maybe you just say that you want consistent growth, and that has to do kind of with the pacing. It's for the reader to kind of feel like we're getting somewhere,
Mm-hmm.
as the books go on. Yeah, I think we'll see how it goes, but so far, I'm kind of leveling him up one level per book.
Mm-hmm.
So he kind of really in this first book, he kind of goes from level 0 to level 1. He almost doesn't have what it takes until a certain thing happens.
Right.
Which also I don't fully explain exactly what happened in book 1 or the significance of it. But yeah, so it's sort of like level 0 to level 1, and then in book 2 he kind of reaches level 2.
This feels more like Western RPGs rather than Eastern RPGs and levels.
Yeah. Well, there's no actual levels. I'm just sort of trying to describe it vaguely to people.
Right.
It's I mean the martial artists have a way of categorizing your strength, and I can't remember if I talk about. I think I do talk about it at the end of book 1. They sort of briefly go over the different rankings, and so. But I also think it can get a little boring if your formula is like you're moving up a level each book.
Mm-hmm.
It can get predictable. And so I also try to add in some twists and turns along the way. So it's not quite exactly perfectly linear.
Well, you've got the whole spiritual energy thing, which is partially tied into martial arts, but not really. What is the link between those two? I know there's a link, but it's not entirely clear.
Yeah, I don't explain it much in the first book, and that's mostly on purpose because I would like to keep some secrets to reveal later on.
That's fine.
It so it's I'm trying to remember what exactly gets explained in the first book. I've been writing the second book for the last couple months now, so
Writing series
I'm
can be difficult.
I'm well into like to other things, and I can't remember
Well, then
exactly what I
let's
talked about in
change
the
let's
first
change
book.
the question up a bit. So up until now, you've written a few works that are standalone, and this is your first series. How does this feel different from the standalones to actually making a series that's going to go on from book to book to book?
Uh, it feels like writing a really long book. It feels like I'm still writing the book right now. I'm like an extra almost 60,000 words further than the end of book one.
Mm-hmm.
But it just feels like I'm continuing on writing the book. I'm just uh,
Looking
it's
for a
gonna
place to breathe.
yeah. I mean it's gonna be book two, but from my perspective, it just feels like I'm continuing the story from where we left off. It's not. It's very much the type of series that is like closely connected. Like it's not really like each book is just the random adventures of main character.
Right. Well, speaking of your characters, the two main characters featured in this book are Ryu and Zash. But you've had a few others in there, and I know you've probably got a lot planned for your other characters. Without spoiling too much, who's your favorite character in this series and why?
Hmm.
I
I
I knew I'd stump you.
yeah. It's hard to say. Like it might be Zash. Um, I don't know. It's like I don't know if this is what it's like for you when you're writing, but like if I recently wrote like a scene with a character, like sometimes I'll be like, man, this is my new favorite character now. And then I write another scene with another character and be like, actually, no, I like this person better.
Well,
Um,
do they feel like so I know when I write, like, all my characters are slightly a self-insert. They're all kind of part of me. How do you feel about your characters?
yeah, I mean, I think that's probably true. I think some amount of you goes into each character, even if it's like a very like minor, something very minor about yourself. Um, I think I probably with like my female characters,
Mm-hmm.
they uh are like a lot of or aspects of them are like my sisters or my mom or previous girlfriends, stuff like that.
Right.
Um,
I would think they all had black hair after reading this book.
yeah, most people have black hair in this world. Not everyone, but it's a very common hair color. They you would basically consider them East Asian mostly.
Mm-hmm.
So if you know
All right.
what features those people tend to have.
Are you very familiar with that part of the world?
Um, Not super familiar. I was born in the Philippines, but the Philippines, I don't know if that's East Asia. That's more like knockoff diet Asia.
Well, that's Southeast Asia, so yeah, you're about right.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, I there's some like rough um, inspiration from actual like ethnic groups in like the Asian continent
Mm-hmm.
for the different groups in my book. Um, I usually try to not, just do a one-to-one like copy paste. I usually take some elements and then add more of my own unique things to them. Um,
Well, so you've based a lot of what you've built on this on I think modern day Asian folklore, but you've made this whole other world. Without spoiling too much, what are some of your favorite parts about this world you've created? I'm sure you've probably come across some parts that you might not share or that haven't been shared yet with this world that you've made. What are some of your favorite parts of this world that you've made?
Well, one thing that I think it's kind of become this like this inside joke, and by inside joke I mean it's literally just me who knows about it. Um, but I'm almost starting to think of myself as like the no horses guy, because in all of my books, mountain midgets, they're not that small.
Oh, we're going to talk about the mountain midgets. I'm just waiting for this topic to go over.
So in all my books, I don't have horses, and it's not because like I hate horses. It's just, you read fantasy and there's lots of cool like fantastical stuff, but they always have horses. And I was like, well, what if, your fantasy world doesn't have horses? Like that kind of changes a lot.
Well, you've got the giant weird mountain cows.
Yeah, so in this world you have Doros, and they are kind of the substitute for both horses and cows or cattle. And they are sort of this weird. They're their own completely made up animal. But if I had to sort of describe them using real world animals, I would say it's like a mix between a buffalo and a bear.
Sounds tasty.
Yeah, great steak. Very, very nutritious steak.
So getting to the Silver's thing, tell us about the doe or the mountain midgets that are in the book.
Yes, I can't actually remember their name, but yeah, so they're people who they're not extinct, but their race is like there's very few of them left, and they live in isolation up around the mountainy areas in the very north of the continent, which is pretty cold, harsh weather. But they are very well adapted to that weather, and they're used to it, and so it doesn't really bother them. And they well, the ones of them that know about it, they really like this type of alcohol that is made from mushrooms, and it's made kind of on the opposite end of the continent. The southeast corner. There's a province in the southeast. There's giant forests there, and that's basically the only place these mushrooms grow.
That sounds like a challenge, making alcohol from mushrooms.
Yeah, well, they can do it. But anyway, so it's a special kind of alcohol that's basically only made there, and they really like it. I'd say they probably like alcohol in general a lot, but they really like that kind. It's their favorite.
Well, I got some other questions here for you. So so I know you've written a few other works. I've touched a little bit on them, but really my schedule's kept me too busy from reading all of them. But I know a lot of authors will have to sometimes leave ideas they really like behind. Did any of them make it into this book?
Several ideas from stuff I've never published made it into this book.
Okay.
I think the one I'm thinking of right now is the idea of a magic that works through meditation, or meditation is what's required to harness magic. And I have a story that's partially written, I think maybe like 40,000 words, where a character has an ability to use a certain kind of magic by meditating. And that story, I don't know. it probably has. I mean, I'm sure it has a lot of problems, but I wasn't quite happy with it. But I really liked the idea. And then when I was sort of world building for this, it felt like it fit like perfectly with this type of sort of Asian style fantasy world.
Mm-hmm.
And so I incorporated it in.
Well, it can be hard because what's the old writing saying? You always have to kill your darlings, the things that you love most in your writing.
Yeah, I think it's more.
So
It's like giving up on your darlings and starting over.
it can be the hardest part of editing. Well, you've made a fairly expansive world this time around. Tell us a little bit about the history of the world in this book.
Yeah, I will tell you about the stuff that doesn't spoil things. So the it's called the Silver Empire right now. So it is one unified empire,
Mm-hmm.
and it was unified by the Silver Emperor, who was this dude who kind of came out of nowhere and started. Well, he started an alliance with one of the other provinces, so that there was an alliance between two of the six.
Right.
And then they basically told the others, like, hey, you should become part of the empire. And mostly they were like, no. And so then that started fighting.
Well, you tell them
And
to join while clacking your spears. It's like, hey, you
yeah.
should join. Click, click, click.
And basically what happened was he would meet a province and they would surrender and say, okay, we'll be part of the empire. Um, and so that was kind of this big war that happened, and it eventually was down to the empire against Do, which is the big northern province, the coldest and harshest, and also where the big uh, Do tribesmen live, who are essentially the most dangerous warriors. Um, they're very strong, very big, very courageous, very ferocious,
Mm-hmm.
and so they don't want to surrender. They're also very like against the idea of being under a ruler.
Right.
Um, but eventually, what happens is the sort of the great chief, or like the chief of the chief. So there's different tribes. They have chiefs,
Mm-hmm.
and then there is a great chief who is kind of makes the decision for all of them, and he eventually decides like, okay, we're gonna come to an agreement with the emperor. And so what happens in order to solidify the agreement is he marries his daughter off to the Silver Emperor, um, and that solidifies Do as part of the empire. So all six provinces are now part of the Silver Empire.
So they're brought in by ways of marriage.
Yeah, and uh, the the basically the chief was worried that there would be like insubordination, that people would not accept the surrender, some
Mm-hmm.
of the Do people, and so the marriage was a way to make the connection between the two stronger, and so that the Do people would feel like they had more of a connection to the empire, um,
Now,
because they're very like tribal, very like familial, and so it's like a big deal if one of them is like the emperor's wife.
mm-hmm.
Um, and so that was done mostly to like appease the people who would probably otherwise not surrender. Um, so since then, uh, the Silver Emperor has died, and he has a son who is technically the emperor, but he's like 13 or 14 at this point, and so he's really just a figurehead. And so who the people who actually run the empire are his mother and the representative council for each of the six provinces. But of course, there's always corruption when you have your representative who's very, very far away from the actual land, who's supposedly making decisions for a province that they have no real like connection to.
That actually sounds like it has some historical basis. I know that there's been several rulers that had their mothers rule along with them because they were far too young to ascend the throne by themselves.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of examples of that, um, and so and you will get to see firsthand kind of a decent amount of this in book 2 because I'm sure you know because you read the end of book 1, but Zash is heading towards the capital at the end of book 1, and you get a lot of his perspective in book 2. So, and he's kind of going to be dealing with, you know, more of the political side of things, which he's not really a fan of, but it ends up being the situation he's put into.
So to shift gears a little bit here, because you've written a few more things, you've garnered a little more success as an author. What have you found the hardest thing about writing?
I mean, I think the hardest thing about writing is just making sure you consistently do it. And yeah, I don't know what it is. Have you read the book The War of Art?
I have not.
Yeah. So it's not a very long book. I think the audiobook's like 3 hours or something. But it's the author, I think it's Stephen Pressfield.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about how he sort of describes, he says it's resistance. He calls it resistance. That's the word. But he says you always, like, every day you get up to write, there's this kind of resistance that's stopping you from writing, and it might manifest as procrastination. It might manifest as you feeling like you don't want to write or feeling like you don't know what to write. All those different things. He says that's all. It's the same thing. It's resistance, and your job as a writer is to every day overcome that resistance and write. And he says if you can do that, then you'll be successful, at least in the sense of you'll get your books done and published. Not necessarily that you'll sell billions of books, but
I'm going to throw that on my list. I'm actually getting ready to do a different kind of review that I'm going to feature on Fridays of each week about people who do how-to books on writing and art and authorship. The first one's actually in the can. I'm just trying to get to map it out properly, but I think I might follow up on this one. I just want to give indie authors like ourselves more of a perspective on the author world.
nice. Yeah, I mean, I would probably say that's my number one book on how to write is The War of Art.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't teach you anything like any technical stuff. What it tries to teach you, I think, is just how to learn to write, consistently, how to write as a professional. And when I say professional, I mean someone who treats writing professionally, not that like you make money or you make a full-time living.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something else that he talks about in the book is the difference between an amateur and a professional, which has nothing to do with, like I said, the amount of money you make or book sales or even how many books you've published. It really has to do with your approach to writing, like, all the time.
Right. So what's the weirdest thing you've had to put into one of your stories?
The weirdest thing.
Like something that you finished writing and you went back and read it and like, I have no idea what I was thinking when I put that in.
Well, I'm wondering, there's a joke in book 2.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if I'm going to wonder about that when I go back. But essentially the joke is, so there's a character, and he wasn't meant to be a super main character, and he isn't like one like a super main character, but he's gotten more screen time than I intended.
Mm-hmm.
He's kind of a jokey character, but there's one point in book 2 where they're eating and he looks over at Ryu and he asks, so he asks him, would you rather fight 10 Cappy-sized Doros? And Cappies are like these like sheep-sized animal that's super fluffy. And he's like, would you rather fight that or would you rather fight one giant Doro-sized Cappy? And I'm wondering if I'm gonna go back and be like, this joke is horrible and stupid and I should delete it, or I'm like, no, people will actually think this is funny and I should leave it.
So what's your stance on humor and authorship?
Well, I think humor is like one of the most subjective parts of writing.
Mm-hmm.
So what one reader might think is hilarious, another reader might like burn your book because of how much it made them cringe. So,
but that's the best jokes that make people cringe so much they burn the book.
Well, it's definitely an impactful joke. But yeah, so I think the way that I approach them is I usually don't try to like go out of my way to make jokes like in the story.
Right.
I think the humor I put in is usually like dry humor, like a character will make like a sarcastic comment kind of thing. Or occasionally like I will just be writing the dialogue and I will like realize that I can kind of insert a humorous moment and it doesn't like mess up the scene.
Mm-hmm.
Then I'll do that. But otherwise I don't really try to force like funny moments into the story.
Well, your characters do seem very serious. Zash feels more reluctant than humorous, and Ryu is very, I don't want to call him depressed, but I can't think of a better word for him.
Yeah, I would probably consider Zash actually a little more depressed than him, although Zash doesn't really realize he's depressed. And I think that it usually just manifests as, I think when other people notice it, they're just like, you're missing something in your life, which I think is true, but I think that his experience is like a slight depression most of the time. I think Ryu, to me, in book 1 is he's sort of this mixture of very motivated and also dealing with like a lot of emotional pain at the same time. And I'm not sure what you would call that.
Maybe traumatized.
Yeah. I would say traumatized. So he's kind of traumatized, and he also is sort of like almost desperately wanting to become something to where he can do something about kind of the trauma in some way. So even though that probably isn't the way you deal with trauma, that's kind of what he's going for, is trying to find a way to deal with his trauma.
Well, Zash is actually one of my favorite characters in this series. He seems to be multi-layered despite his general success. What are your feelings on Zash as you create him as the author?
So when I was originally like plotting things out and like figuring out the characters, I sort of thought of him as Obi-Wan Kenobi, kind of, in that Obi-Wan is this character who throughout like all 6 movies, he tries to do the right thing. He tries to be like a good Jedi, and I think he more or less does, but he constantly sort of is met with tragedy. And so he's this like, to me, he's kind of this tragic character who he's maybe one of the like best exemplars of a Jedi, and at the same time he kind of has a lot of terrible things happen to him.
Yep.
And so that was kind of my general conception as like a character archetype for Zash. And then of course, as as I planned more and more, Zash became a little bit more of his own person and his own arc. And I can't tell you too much because that's going to get really close to spoilers about things that happen to Zash later on.
Right.
So, but that's I would say that's what I started with him.
I actually really liked Zash just for his reluctant teacher angle. He's actually a fairly competent teacher because, as far as I see it, Ryu was. I mean, he was a fisher boy up until 17. I'm assuming he's basically illiterate, and still he was teaching him how to fight, and basically got him on par with a lot of the masters in some aspects.
Yeah, he does a good job. Uh, he I don't think he gets him on par with masters or even the other trainees, but he definitely, considering what he has to work with, I think he does a really good job. And yes, I think he definitely underestimates his own abilities with teaching, because he sort of has a very loner mentality, and he doesn't think of himself as having much use to give to other people in terms of like his experience or his knowledge. He sort of sees like the other like masters or grandmasters as the people who are good at that, and he's the guy who's not good at that. That's like kind of the way he sees himself.
Like actually, he reminded me a lot of Raiden for Mortal Kombat, but that might just be his particular lightning based style.
Yeah, I mean, I think that has to do with his appearance at first glance. Is people tend to think that they think that he's inspired by that. He actually wasn't. I didn't make the connection that they were similar until after we had the cover art. So
what's the aside from that, what's something else that you may have put in a book that you didn't realize until after it was done? Like something that you caught and you're like, oh no, why'd I do that?
I will probably make that realization about this book, like when I'm writing book 3 or something, and I realize like I said something that I wish I hadn't because now it ties my hands. So,
all right. So moving on.
Danica thinks it's the river monsters from the Black Saint. But, yeah, as I think that was. I mean, she pointed it out. So she's my editor, by the way, if you didn't know.
Oh, I did not know. I try to keep track of everybody, but everything moves too fast for me. I just try to flow through as best I can. You know me, I miss all the drama.
Yeah. So I don't know if you've read The Black Saint, but there's a port near the beginning where the character encounters these monsters in the river. They almost eat him, and then he gets away. And I don't think that they ever show up again in the book. And she has pointed out correctly that I should either have done more with them or maybe just cut them, which is probably right.
I actually got to get started on the Black Saint, but I unfortunately, I think I started reading it around last Christmas, and the Christmas rush at work just kind of pushed it out of my to-do list.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Silver says, no, they don't, damn it.
Yeah. She doesn't think they should be in the book. Which is probably, I would say that's probably true. So I'm actually like, I don't want to like chase people off of reading the Black Saint, but I have several criticisms of the book myself, but I've been really surprised that people keep on reading it and then telling me how much they enjoyed it. So I don't know, even though I feel like I made a lot of mistakes, it seems like people still like the book.
So how many, I lost track after the Black Saint because I kind of got lost in my own stuff at the time. How many works have you done so far?
Well, if you count the Vela stories, then let's see. There's Black Saint. There's A Touch of Madness. There's the Battle for Pilgrim's Fall, and then there is the Ghosts of Zovus 4, and then there's my new book. So 5.
Wow, that's actually quite a bit. I
Yeah.
think it's been. I think you've done that in the last year and a half.
Yeah, but 2 of those Vela stories are like novella length, so they're not like full novel length, so they're shorter.
So, what have you learned in these 5 works that you've done? What if you had to give some advice to somebody who's just starting out? What would you tell them from your experience so far?
Um, well, I would try to find out what they want out of writing before I give them any advice, because depending on what you wanting uh, is going to change what I say a lot. If you're someone who you just feel like you really like it, you like storytelling, you like writing stories,
Mm-hmm.
um, then I don't know. I wouldn't have much advice. Just keep, write, enjoy it. If all you want is to enjoy it, then make sure you're enjoying it. If you're not enjoying it, then don't
Well,
force yourself to keep going.
let me rephrase it then, and I'm just going to assume you're familiar with the terms. So we had a little project ourselves in our gilded group that it kind of fell to the wayside for a while there. Um, how do you feel on people who are heavy planners versus people who are pantsers, people who kind of do things spur of the moment and as they come up? What are your thoughts on that in writing?
Um, I think, I think everyone is technically a pantser.
Mm-hmm.
The difference is that if you make an outline, you do all your pantsing at the very beginning before you even start writing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it's really a matter of when do you want to have to do all the work of fixing your story. Do you want to do it during the outlining, or do you want to write the whole book and then go back and do all the fixing from there? And me personally, I would rather do it during the outline because I feel like that's a lot less work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I also feel like if I have a strong outline, I don't get stuck when I'm trying to write the book. Uh, so yeah, I think that's generally my thoughts.
So what do you see as the benefits of planning these out? Because I know you're a heavy planner with the things that you do.
Um, the benefit of planning, I think, is that can you should be able to have a really strong ending, or at least a very satisfying ending. Um, and I think like I said, the other benefit is that I think you write books faster because you don't get stuck. You don't
Mm-hmm.
get to points where you don't know what is going to happen next. Um, so yeah, I think those are the benefits.
So getting into the controversial stuff, because of course we have to have something controversial. With the threat of AI coming into the writing world, what are your feelings on AI and writing, and do you think it actually has a place in our world?
Um, I think it will have a place in the world, regardless of if it should.
Mm-hmm.
My I'll just give my own very personal thoughts, which is that to me, I don't know why, because I know there's people who say, well, I can have a AI write a rough draft, and then I will take the rough draft and I will go through the whole thing and edit it into a good story.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, yeah, that's less work. That's a lot less work. But to me, the work is part of the book. Like I don't know. I even though it's a lot of work, I would never want to give up that hard work to someone else. Like I wouldn't want another person necessarily to write a story and then give it to me and have me like edit it into a better story.
Right.
And I also wouldn't want an AI to do it. So even though yes, it's more work and it takes longer, I kind of I feel like that's part of writing a book.
Well, as an
It's not
author,
about. Go ahead.
as an author, if you had to come up with one tool that you could have that you currently don't have, what would it be? Something to make your writing easier and better.
I mean, maybe I would just get one of those. I don't know what you call them. They're essentially just computers, but the only thing that you can use them for is writing. So there's no way to get distracted.
Like a word processor?
Yeah, I mean, there are word processors. Like there's different places that sell them, but they're different. Like they have different branding, but they all are essentially just it's a computer, right? It's computing, but the only thing it can do you can do on it is write. So essentially, it's essentially you can only use Word, but I don't know if it's specifically Word that it uses as a processor.
My experience, Word is a terrible program for actual writing if you got anything that's stupid long form. But we do have a question from the audience is what do you think is the most important aspect about being an independent publisher, such as promotion, content, editing, etc.? And what are you strongest at?
The most important thing as far as a publisher goes is probably going to be marketing. I mean, you don't sell books if people don't know your book exists. So
true. That seems to be a stumbling block a lot of people come across.
Yeah, and it's hard. I mean, there are a lot of independent authors trying to sell you their book like these days. So you've got competition. But yeah, I think probably you need a foundation, and that foundation is quality cover art. It doesn't have to be the very best ever, but it needs to be it needs to meet the quality of the other books like in your genre, basically, that are selling. It can be better. It can be like super, super high quality. You could pay like a lot of money for really good art, but I think there's diminishing returns at a certain point where, the cover is going to be good enough. And at that point, you're not going to get a lot of extra people buying it because they think the art is just better.
So what are your opinions on cover art? Like, do you like to buy the art, or if you had the choice for AI covers, would you pick that?
I personally, I mean, AI art will get better. I think that's just a reality. But personally, like, and maybe it's because I've seen a lot of it now, like, I don't like the way AI art looks. It looks just too
fake.
Yeah, it looks fake, even though I'm not really sure why it looks fake. But so yeah, I would definitely prefer an actual artist art just because I think it looks better. And I think also like the AI always composes the art the same way, whereas actual artists will sometimes do really interesting and dynamic things with the cover art.
I feel it's only a matter of time, though. AI art is bound to get much better, though I still like to hire regular artists.
Yeah. I mean, I don't really care that much what other people do. If you want to use AI for you, I mean, I know other authors who use AI for their covers. But as long as I am able to hire artists, I would much rather do that.
I agree. But it's also because we're also all part of the same area of the internet, the area of the entertainment industry. We kind of have to have each other's backs. At least that's as far as I feel.
Yeah. And a lot of my thoughts about AI like get really deep like into my own philosophy on like life and the universe, and so it's probably not an area we want to get into. So
Oh, we've covered some interesting stuff in these interviews, and part of this is to get to know the authors who are writing the book. So you feel free to expound on anything you feel you need to.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, like, I don't want to end up talking for like 30 minutes about like humans, sort of the potential post-human world and things like that. So
Oddly enough, I think humans are going to be a major part of the post-human world, just because we're the ones creating it.
yeah. Well, I would guess that you are more optimistic than me, at least about that.
I always try to be optimistic, but that's because if you're not, you're going to cry.
Yeah. Well, I've always been a pessimist my whole life, so.
Well, a pessimist is just an optimist who hasn't been a pessimist long enough. I'm kidding with you. So, if you could pick one author's mind, any successful author of any time period, to improve your own work, who would it be and why?
Hmm. I might have said Brandon Sanderson, but honestly, like, I've already kind of gotten to do that because of how much information he has out about the way that he thinks and about the way that he writes.
True.
Um, that's something I'll say for new writers.
Mm-hmm.
Go watch one of his lecture series. There's like ones from different years. They're on YouTube for free. Lots of super helpful and really like concrete advice that he gives for writing.
Now, that being said, he did have a hand in Shadow of the Conqueror by Shad Brooks, which I don't know if you've read that. That was an awful book.
I haven't read it. I saw your review and I saw some other people's review, and no one seemed to have super great things to say about it. I don't know what involvement he has, but I'm guessing he probably didn't have very much involvement with it.
Now,
Just based off of the quality of his own books.
Now, here's an interesting question for you. A lot of major YouTubers have been in the past year or two getting involved in the author space, but almost none of them seem to have made a decent book, with the exception of Daniel Green, who made I think, made a pretty good book. Why do you have any opinions on why they might be having such trouble making a decent showing in the author space?
Well, I would guess that it's because writing a book is hard, and it takes a lot of practice to write a good one.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it takes a lot of work to write a bad one, even not just a one that's good. But yeah, I mean, it's probably just lack of experience. I think that they have the problem of instant success, kind of regardless of the quality of their book or the potential problems with it, and so there's no like push for them to reevaluate or go back and try to work more on the story or whatever.
Okay. I've always thought it just might be they're a little too big for them to receive any kind of real critical feedback. But I imagine it's actually an amalgamation of several issues put together, just like many other problems in the world. But let's get back to you, because this interview is about you. What has encouraged you and inspired you to become an author?
I mean, I don't know if this is not encouragement, it's kind of the opposite, but like the initial reason I started trying to write stories at all was because I was frustrated that I couldn't find the type of stories I wanted to read. So yeah, I'm not sure what you call that. You call that frustration, I guess, not encouragement. But it was a motivation.
Right.
Um,
Well, what would you say was a turning point in the failings of modern writing and possibly modern Hollywood that got you to be a writer?
Um, well, I think there's kind of two different things. For me specifically, my frustration, I think, was more that I wanted like stories that had like cool action, interesting magic, like fantastical worlds, but I also didn't want them to be like 300,000 words long. And it
What you
was
don't?
hard to, yeah, it was hard to find. So I could find books that were 3,000 words, 300,000 words long, and they had those cool things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there was parts of them I enjoyed, but then there was parts that I was like bored to death by. And then I would find the short books, and they were short and fast paced, but they didn't like the magic was very like meh, and the action scenes were just kind of like okay. And so it was like
striking.
I could never
Stri-
find both of the things I wanted together.
it's striking that balance between an easy read, but also has all the cool stuff you want to see with that emotional investment.
Yeah. So that was my personal gripe. I
Just
think
slight, just slightly off topic. Have you read the Malazan series?
I've read book one. I've read Gardens of the Moon. It
That
was it was I could see why people really like it. That's what I'll say.
mm-hmm. You
Um,
can't tell me that book wasn't a trial to get through, though.
it was it didn't feel painful. It just felt very confusing most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And it probably didn't feel painful just because I'm used to really complicated worlds and complicated plots and stuff. I imagine it could definitely be painful for someone who's not used to that. Um,
So here's one of the questions I often like to ask other authors. If one of your books or book series was to be made into a movie, what would you be willing to compromise on, and what would you not be willing to compromise on?
uh, I mean, I would probably say the types of things I would compromise on are potential like plot point changes if I thought that the change was as good as the original plot or made it better in some way. I think the kind of things I wouldn't compromise on are like changing the race of the characters or the sex of the characters, um, stuff like that.
It can be challenging because Hollywood wants to change a lot. Now, if you could set up your dream movie, who would you like to direct it? Assuming you're familiar with directors, it's not something I particularly am, but a lot of people are. How would you like to set it up, and who would you like to create it?
My dream movie, like just whatever random movie I want to make, or what?
Random movie you want to make, or based on one of the books that you have made so far?
Um, well, honestly, probably like if I could choose anything I wanted, I would probably just go with an animated TV show
Mm-hmm.
of my book series of the
Mm-hmm.
Silver Empire series,
Mm-hmm.
like something similar to Avatar: The Last Airbender.
They did a really good job with that show. I could see them doing well with this.
Yeah. I mean, I think I definitely kind of in the back of my mind um, built like the world and then the way the magic works and everything to be very visual friendly. So I think it would definitely work really well as like an anime style TV show. Um, there are the magic has a lot of color involved with it,
Mm-hmm.
and that obviously color is going to be way more impactful when you can see it rather than when I describe it in a book. So I
So
don't
let's
know. I don't know about who are the good anime directors or whatever. Or I guess it's really mostly about like getting a good studio.
Well, I know what you mean. Even if I knew who they were, I probably couldn't pronounce their names. So, um, So I heard you on the on another podcast, and you were talking about the different magic systems in your book. And I know that you have some different entities and different magical systems. I know you have them all set up next to each other. Tell us a little bit about the contrast between the different magic systems in your book.
Um, so that there's the magic that's kind of what would you call it? It's personal and it's like embodied in a person.
Mm-hmm.
So you are kind of the channel for your magic. Your ability to train and improve is how you can get better at the magic.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
That's always a good theme.
yeah, and and that's like the magic that Ryu is learning
Mm-hmm.
uh, in book one, and that Zash is already a master of. And then the other magic is it's um, it's channeled through this special kind of stone, and they usually just call it sorcery stone.
Mm-hmm.
It's this like special black kind of rock,
Mm-hmm.
and you can write runes on it, and the runes are sort of like a coding language, um, and you can get different effects based off of the runes you write.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, you could put a fire rune on the rock,
Mm-hmm.
and then you get flame and heat to shoot out of it. And then you could do it like you could do a very very basic fire rune, and that's going to give you a very basic flame, or
Mm-hmm.
you could have more complicated runes. Um, you could have multiple runes that are all basically like together, like the way you could have multiple letters together making a word or multiple words making a sentence kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can get a more specific or a more powerful effect. So instead of like a small amount of flame coming out, you could have something more like a flamethrower or some other effect. You could have it so it actually there's no fire; it's just a little bit of heat over like a long period of time.
So
So
you
like,
could effectively weaponize this if you wanted.
yeah, and uh, and you get to see it in book two. People use gauntlets, and these gauntlets are essentially they have multiple of these sorcery stones on them,
Mm-hmm.
and the stones all have a lot of runes, and they um, basically allow you to be like an elemental bender, like in uh, Avatar: The Last Airbender, where you can, if you have an air gauntlet on, then you can be an airbender with that arm at least.
I can live the dream
Yeah, and
without
that,
being a vegan.
yeah, and like Danica says, they eventually wear out after so much use because channeling the energy through them slowly.
And so she does ask how many uses you could get out of a firestone. Stone. I assume it's more of an approximate than an exact thing. Assuming somebody got a new one, about how many uses would they get out of it?
Um, well, if you have a very like simple like rune, you would probably get a lot out of it because that's not going to take much energy. The reason why gauntlets have lots of stones on them is because they are usually using a whole bunch of energy. Like if you're using enough energy to shoot wind out and blow someone like into the air,
Mm-hmm.
that's obviously a lot more energy than if you're creating a light breeze blowing through your room or something. And so that's why a gauntlet is made up of like many stones, because otherwise you'd get like one or two uses out of it before it was used up.
Ah. So speaking of the magic, you've also got spirits in your world. Now, I notice they're kept a bit ambiguous. Is that something you intend to continue forward?
Um, you will get you will get more of the spirits. You will There's big spoilers about things. I can't say too much without giving it away. But
Well,
there are
without
things related to
spoiling,
the spirits. There are more things that are going to be happening for sure.
tell us a little bit about how the spirits in your world work.
Um, so there, okay, so there's two planes. There's the physical plane and the spirit plane.
Mm-hmm.
And spirits mostly stay in the spiritual plane, and that's because they can't cross over to the physical plane same way that like the people can't cross over to the spiritual plane normally. Of course, you're going to see something happen in book 2 that kind of breaks that rule slightly.
Mm-hmm.
But I won't say much about it. But that's basically the way it works. And then there are areas in the world where this separation is much more blurred, and so spirits are actually able to, for small amounts of time, basically come into the physical world. And spirits tend to, some are harmless, some are ambivalent, but they don't really understand that like humans are something you could kill.
Mm-hmm.
And so even though they aren't necessarily evil, they might end up, hurting or driving a human insane.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are spirits who are uh, basically like super predators who will, just because they like to hunt down and kill humans if they're able to. Of course, most of the time they're not, because they can't be in the physical world.
What does it take for one of the spirits to be in the physical world?
It takes either, like I said, for them to be in one of those locations where there is a blurring between the two planes, or
Mm-hmm.
it takes some other very strong force to tear a hole between the two and
Mm-hmm.
allow them out. So I think that's basically the two ways. I guess you can use, basically the knowledge has been lost, but it is possible to use rune stones
Mm-hmm.
to force someone into the opposite plane if you know what you're doing, which basically almost no one does.
Mm-hmm.
But it would be possible to temporarily use the rune stones to travel into the spirit plane if you're a person, or to travel the opposite direction if you're a spirit.
Now, are you intending to keep the spirits more mysterious, or are you going to have more of a hard system for how the spirits work?
Um, I will probably keep them pretty mysterious from the reader's point of view. There are
Mm-hmm.
things I know, but that's mostly so that I know what I'm doing with the story. Um,
Well, you got to set rules for yourself as the author.
yeah. You will see more of them involved in certain ways. Um, as with the other things, saying almost anything else is is a spoiler. But
Ah.
you're going to see more, and you're going to see things happen with them involved in like the main plot. So
Well, up till this point, everything you've written has been standalone, and this is your first dive into doing a major series. What do you feel is the biggest change to going from standalone books to a series?
the biggest change is you've got to plan way further ahead. um, you you don't just have to think about the character arc for a book. You have to think about the character arc for the whole series as well as the character arc for the book.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of the same thing with the general plot. Like you have to think about how the plot is going to begin and end for the book, but also how that plot ties into the next book, and how that plot ties into the next book, and so on and so on. So I think that's the big thing. And I
So now,
think that just means you're doing a lot more work everywhere. So you're doing a lot more plotting work, you're doing a lot more world building work, you're
mhm.
doing a lot more character work. Yeah.
Do you ever have to use like external aids aside from your own writing to help you with your books?
Like like a program to keep track or whatever. Is that what you mean?
Well, to give you an example, in my case, when I have to do a large scale battle, I will often use a D&D map to map where everybody is. I know some people have to use programs in order to keep track of where things are and who's where. And generally the lore they've created. Is there anything outside of just your own written notes that you have to use or that you like to use in order to make your writing easier?
I mean, really, all I need is the world map, and then I have my master document, which has basically everything about the world. So it has all the names of every character that's named. You know, it has the all the locations listed, and like generally short descriptions about them or anything that I need to remember. It has like all the made up animals that I have made up and
Right.
what they are. It has a description of how the magic works. It has explanations about the secrets that I haven't revealed yet in the story, all that stuff. So,
All right, well, let's get to a fun question. And I like to ask people some stuff to throw them off a little bit, just because as authors, we need more experiences so we can put into books, so we can make people enjoy themselves a little bit more. But what's the most embarrassing thing you've ever had to research while writing your books?
most embarrassing. Well, I don't know if it's embarrassing, but I've looked up like how long a body stays warm after it dies.
Ooh, that's morbid.
Yeah. I think both that and then how long it takes for a body to start decaying.
It's one of those things that ruins the zombie movie for you.
Yeah. And it puts you on some FBI lists as well.
If we're not on FBI lists by now, I mean, we just ain't trying.
That's true. I probably was before that. I'm sure I've had other searches that were very suspicious, but I can't remember off the top of my head.
Well, what's the coolest thing you've learned from your research while writing?
Uh, hmm. I feel like the coolest thing is probably some fact about space, but I can't think of what it would be. But I do remember when I was writing The Ghost of Zovas 4, which is, I guess that's the only sci-fi I've written, really.
Okay.
But when I was researching for that, I think I probably looked up stuff about. I probably looked up a bunch of stuff about how you could pretend that your world has artificial gravity or technology for artificial gravity.
So, so I have another question for you, and this might help a lot of authors out there. And it's a problem I've run into with other authors. It's a common complaint that I've had, others have had, but you can succeed without it, just like Brandon Sanderson did. What are your take on having professional prose? I hear people talk about having purpled prose or very exact prose, but we've known people who've done very well without having very exacting prose. What's your take on that?
I mean, my take is you should write the kind of prose that you like to write. So if you like to write, flowery, like really descriptive, really like literary prose, then you should go for that. I am basically the opposite. I try to make it clear what's happening in the story, but I don't try to be fancy. So as long as you are understanding what's happening and you're not being like pulled out of the story because of like a weird word I wrote or something, then that's basically my goal. I think I probably have over time, as I've gotten more experience, started to maybe add in a little bit more of, like fancy metaphors here and there, but probably not much more.
So now that you are an author, you've written several works, and I've noticed that your new book is actually doing pretty well, or at least as far as reviews go. Well, darn, I forgot what I was going to ask. What would you do? Do you talk to other people in your life? How do you introduce yourself as an author? Do you even talk to people in your life about being an author?
I don't usually like bring it up as an introduction. It'll usually come up if you're talking to someone and they ask you like, what stuff do you do? And you're like, oh, I write books. And then they're like, what? Because usually don't meet people who write books.
Mm-hmm.
And then you explain that, yeah, you can get my book on Amazon. Just look it up right now. You'll see it. Stuff like that.
Now,
So,
if you're like me and you run into people, they'll say it's like, "Oh, I got an idea for a book, but I don't think I'll ever finish it." What would you tell people who've got an idea for a book but just can't seem to get it done?
I would say if you really want to get it done, well, one, it's going to be hard. There's no, I mean, there's probably some authors who just love every minute of writing, but I would say for most writers, it's going to feel like work. And that doesn't really mean that your story's bad. It's just because it's a lot of work. And so if you really want to get your story done, you need to commit and, plan out your strategy for how you're going to finish it. Like if you're struggling to work on it, like you're procrastinating or you just kind of feel demotivated, then you've got to figure out some strategy. I mean, my personal, like the way that I generally work is I try to write every day or almost every day. Kind of basically, I don't focus on how I'm feeling about it. I just sit down and I write something every day. Some days I feel really good about it. Some days I feel just meh. Every once in a while I feel really bad, but usually I don't feel terrible about it. It's usually I feel like I just feel like, oh, I just got another 1,000 words.
Well,
And
we got a question from the audience for you. Do you find it harder to make a character relatable when you write supernatural works?
supernatural meaning like just fantastical elements or
I would assume so.
specifically
Anything that's beyond the natural world that we know of. That's what I'm assuming supernatural to be.
um I don't think it's I think it's harder just because you can get distracted with all the fantasy, right? So when you're if you're writing a book set in like supposedly our real world, obviously it's fiction, but like say your setting is meant to be like, you know, some US city modern year, you already have your entire world built for you. So all you have to focus on is the character, their arc, their emotions, their relationships, whatever. Whereas when you're building a fantasy world, you have to do all of that building yourself. And so you can get distracted from really fleshing out your characters because you spent all your time and your effort fleshing out the world. Um, and you can get distracted too by writing in and adding all these cool fantasy elements in, but you're not spending much time really like giving the character a clear motivation or a clear personality or things like that. I
Mm-hmm.
think that's stuff that I've struggled with in the past, and something I've tried to work on is to make sure that my characters have some strong elements to them of an actual character, and they aren't just random, blank NPCs in a cool world.
Sorry, having some technical difficulties. Can you guys hear me?
I hear you. You
Awesome.
sound, you sound like you're coming through a different channel, but
Sorry about that. My computer is very analog setup.
uh,
So, another question I had for you, because a lot of people find this a little bit challenging, referring to the tyranny of the blank page. Do you feel you write better with less restrictions or implementing more restrictions on what you're writing about?
um, basically, I always write better with more restrictions. Um, Something I do sometimes um, is like if I'm starting a new scene, and so I've got whatever chapter, whatever the next chapter is written, and it's blank. What I'll do is I will just start to write out what I know needs to happen in that scene.
Mm-hmm.
So it's basically like an outline. I'm writing a little mini outline.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll write like Ryu is going to Um, he's going to enter this town, and he's going to get a new traveling robe, and then he's going to go to the bar with Zash, and then after that, they're going to go to sleep. And if I have that little outline there, that helps me to just kind of get going. And then once I'm going, it's easy to kind of keep the momentum up. But that little outline kind of helps with the beginning, which is kind of the hard part when you write, which is just getting moving.
So, what would be outside, not just outside of what you've done, because you've done a number of different works. What is your favorite type of genre to write?
I mean, it's sci-fi fantasy. I consider them to be the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's anything with, you know, fantastical elements. I mean, I understand like people differentiate sci-fi and fantasy, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't. But for me as an author, when and constructing worlds and stories in those worlds, it's all just fantastical stories or stories in fantastical settings. So it could be a spaceship, it could be a forest with giant trees. To me, it's technically the same thing, but basically, yeah, anything with fantastical settings is what I like to write.
What do you think would be your least favorite to write? I know you've only written in a few genres, but what do you think would be the hardest or least enjoyable that you would have to write?
I mean, probably romance. Like, I feel like I just I would just struggle for like a romance plot to be the A plot.
Mm-hmm.
Like I have some romance elements in my stories, but they're always B or C plots,
Mm-hmm.
and there's not a whole bunch of time devoted to them. I feel like if I had to try and make the story about a romance, I feel like I would get bored and struggle to like get through it.
That's a shame. That's the most profitable
Yeah, I
type
know,
of
right?
genre to write.
I am shooting myself in the foot,
All right.
but
Well,
yeah, I you know.
well, let's get into the more technical aspects. Say you were to make your current series an audiobook, who would you want to narrate it?
Um, well, I think my favorite audiobook narrator is Simon Vance.
Mm-hmm.
Although with with the Silver Empire, I mean, he wouldn't be a bad choice, but I sort of wonder if maybe there was someone who would fit like the world a little bit better.
It's a shame the guy who did General Iroh from Avatar is dead. He would have been a very good fit for that.
Oh yeah, he would be great. Yeah, I mean, um, just going off like the type of story,
Mm-hmm.
someone like Travis Baldry would probably be good. Like, he's done a lot of the similar types of stories that are like progression focused fantasy series or books.
All right, we got another question here. Hang on a second. It says, what would be the albums among the top 10 in your music collection, genres, albums, and collections of CDs? So, what's your favorite music, basically?
Um, it's probably going to be a lot of like orchestral soundtracks from movies, video games, basically anywhere where I find it. Um, yeah, that's most of what I listen to, and maybe it's because I write, and so I like listening to like something without lyrics that still kind of gives me ideas or helps me like come up with new ideas. Um, yeah, I don't really listen to a lot of other music besides that.
All right. Well, here's another question for you. It might be a little more on topic. So, as authors, it is incumbent upon us to read. So, who are some of your favorite authors to read when you are not working?
Um, I do like Brandon Sanderson, although I will say, even when I really like his books, they always feel too long for me. And that's probably why I put like the same elements in my stories, but I write a lot shorter books.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel shorter is better than longer, or longer is better than shorter in
I
books?
mean, it's preference. It depends on the reader. It depends on what you wanting to accomplish with your story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely people who like the longer, fantasy epics.
Well, let's phrase it a different way. Would you rather write something short and punchy, or something long and epic?
Well, I've written a lot of short things, so I would probably like to write something long and epic, but wanting to and actually like doing it or having the ability to do
Mm-hmm.
it are two different things. So, but
What are
yeah, it would be fun to do something different. And in this case, different would be long and epic versus my shorter stuff.
what's the most startling thing that now that you're an author that you know about being an author as opposed to before you started writing?
I don't know if I would describe it as startling, but really the fact that this, like most of the skill of an author is the ability to just stick with your project and get it done, even though it's going to be a lot of hard work and you're not going to have fun for most of it. Versus before, I always imagined that in order to be a good author, you had to like just have a, you know, very high level grasp of English and a very like in super creative mind and like this ability to like sort of pull together entire like novel length plots in your head.
Right.
And the reality is just it's just a lot of hard work, and most people could probably do it if they were willing to put in all that work.
What's something that disappoints you the most about now that you're this far into the publishing industry?
Disappoints me
About being an author, publishing your own stuff, just the writing world in general.
um I think it's a little disappointing that like essentially you have to use Amazon. Like they are such a monopoly that if you
Mm-hmm.
are interested in selling even a few books, like you need them to do it. There aren't other options really.
That's true. Amazon really does have their fist clenched around this pretty tight.
But
All right.
yeah.
Well, let me get you to the questions that I ask everybody. The first is, would you like to live in the world that you have created?
Hmm. It might depend on where I am. I don't know if I want to be in like Oroto and be randomly killed by bandits. That would not be fun.
Mm-hmm.
It might be fun to live up on the mountain in the sanctuary and get to train martial arts all day,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe live in the like capital city where everyone's rich and well fed, or most people are anyway.
All right. Well, here's the opposite of the question. What fantasy world or fictional world would you absolutely 100% not want to live in, and why?
Probably Joe Abercrombie's world. I don't remember what it's called, but basically everyone in that world is miserable and has terrible things happen to them all the time. And it doesn't really matter if you try to be a good person or a bad person, you'll have terrible things happen to you. So I guess I'll pick that.
I mean, there's such a surplus of terrible worlds to be in.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots to choose from.
All right. Well, what do you think? So here's a question I do like to ask because it's kind of filtering into publishing in general. How do you feel about politics making its way into publishing?
Uh, I mean, I think it generally has a negative effect. You've seen it in like Hollywood, like when real world politics gets into like creative things like art, movies, TV shows, books, like it makes the product worse because you're not devoting all of your energy to the entertainment of the product. You're devoting some or most of your energy to something else, which is usually like some message that you're interested in, or you're sacrificing some element of the story for that.
Okay. So, how do you feel about the message versus the story? There's a lot of people who find the message of a book to be more important than the story. And then there are people who also believe that the story is the most important element, regardless of the message. Where do you fall in those camps?
I think generally your message is going to be much stronger if you don't try to push it hard
Mm-hmm.
on the reader. And that will sometimes mean that they will get a different message than maybe you intended because you aren't trying to say this is like what you should think or whatever. You're just putting elements into the story that the reader can then interpret as they read and experience it. Right? Because the reality is like there are politics in every book, but they aren't real world politics.
Agreed.
There aren't real world politics in every book. And there is some element of my own world view that's going to go into my writing. Um, I think it's really about focusing on trying to tell an entertaining story. And I mean, I usually try, I try to imagine this world as, something completely different. So these characters, what they think, what their opinions are, um, these they don't necessarily match up with mine. They might
Mm-hmm.
be completely opposite. They might just think in a very like alien way to the way I think or whatever. But if I try to write the story as if that's what the world is like, I think that I end up with less of it being like this is Timo's worldview put into a story and more of just this is a fantasy story.
Right. So you feel you can separate yourself from the politics of the world and basically let your characters have a different view, or do you feel like they all have to align with your own view?
Uh, yeah, I try to give them. I mean, it's more of like you come up with a character and you think about okay, who is this character? What does he feel strongly about? What does he dislike? And as you're asking those questions, you start to form them, right? But of course, at a very low level, you are influenced because you have views on what's like right and wrong, what's
Mm-hmm.
good and bad, and that affects like when you decide to make a good character, you will probably always make them good in the way that you see goodness, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that means that like that you your world like if you have some strong political views about the real world that then your book is going to be like if you're a very strong libertarian that doesn't necessarily mean that you will write a super libertarian fantasy book.
Right.
There will probably be elements of your thinking right that'll be in there, but if you do a good job I don't think it's going to be like I don't think someone's going to read this and be like yep this is definitely written by a libertarian.
So, moving from politics to what everybody thinks politics is, good and evil, how do you feel about the dichotomy of good and evil in books? Do you like to have some gray area or do you like to keep it all black and white?
I like there to be like a good chunk of good, a good chunk of bad, and then a little bit of gray in the middle,
Mm-hmm.
so that it generally will feel like good versus bad, and then occasionally the reader will experience some of the gray and be like, okay, well sometimes there's more complicated things than just good and bad. But I definitely don't try to do like everyone is sort of a mix of good and bad necessarily.
So, here's the big question. How do you feel about the trope of subverting expectations?
Um, Subverting expectations, it can mean I think two different things. You can mean surprising the reader with something that they never ever expected or would have never guessed, or it can mean giving them a twist that they weren't expecting, but they might have, they could have potentially guessed if you were asking them, okay, what's going to happen at the end of the story. Because in one of those, you're basically just you're just surprising them, like you're making sure that they will never guess what you're going to do, but that isn't satisfying, right? And in the other, they are surprised, but then they aren't like shocked, they aren't confused, right? They're like, whoa, I didn't see that twist coming, but now that it happened, like I could understand why it happened.
Do you feel like that should be an intentional thing or an accidental thing?
It should hopefully be intentional most of the time. I mean, I guess if like in your first draft you do it and you don't realize it, you can go back and set things up so it is more smooth.
So we got a follow-up question from the audience for you. What do you advise an independent author to do to get more readers as far as advertising, promoting, and how to sell your books the best?
If you want to get a lot of people to notice you, what I would do is make your book free, and then spend money on one of the big promo sites and give away a bunch of free books. Which I know a lot of people, they don't like that. That doesn't sound good, right? Because you're making no money.
Right.
But if you're trying to find an audience, you're trying to find readers, that is probably one of the best, if not the best way to get people to read your book. And that's kind of what you need when you're starting out. You don't necessarily need to worry about trying to make a bunch of money. I mean, if you do, that's great, and you're an outlier, but most people are not just going to publish a book and then suddenly be selling thousands of copies a month.
So you feel reaching more readers is more important than making money on the actual book itself?
If your goal is long-term to be, either part-time or full-time doing publishing books, I would say yes, because if you get a lot of people to read your book, then you get a lot of people to know who you are, which they didn't before. And if you give away 1,000 free books, that doesn't mean that you lost out on 1,000 sales. That means that 1,000 people who would never have read your book potentially may read it now. Like, obviously, when you give away a free book, not everyone reads the book, then they'd get it. But some good percentage of them are going to read your book when they otherwise wouldn't. And the best thing for a new author is to get, exposure, in my opinion. It's not really to get money.
Now, without being too specific, and I do like to point people in the right direction, where would you encourage people to go do this? You don't have to name any specific, you don't have to name like too specific a place, but maybe rattle off a couple of places that you've used.
Yeah, I think probably the best ones that I've personally used are Free Booksy is one. What is the other? Fussy Librarian. And then I think it's Robin Reads, I think is what it's called. I think those three sites all, I've had a pretty good experience with them. Like, I mean, you're going to pay a nice chunk of money to do the promo, but I mean, I'll say with my Free Booksy, when I made my book free and I did the promo, I had over 2,000 downloads of the book.
So to clarify for our audience, do these count as giveaways for your book?
They count as giveaways in the sense that you're giving the book away for free. What it is I guess I should explain a little more. So as long as you are exclusive to Amazon with your ebook, you every 3 months, I think it is, you are given the option to either reduce the price or make it free for, I think you're allowed 5 days is the
Right.
max. And so what you need to do is, assuming you have it exclusive, you set up your date for when your book is going to be free, and then you go to the promo site and you pay the fee, and then you pick the day. I would probably do it in the other order. So you go to the site, make sure that you have the days available for you. And then once that's there, then you go to Amazon, make sure that your book will be free, that you set your book be free on that date. And then basically people will buy the book from Amazon through the promo site will send them to Amazon. And so they are buying your book on Amazon. Just it's free, so that you're not making any money while that's happening.
So about in general, how much do you normally pay for this?
I think Free Booksy was the most expensive promo I've ever tried, and it was over $100 for that one.
Ooh.
Yeah. And it was also by far the most successful in terms of people getting the book. I've tried a lot now, and it seems like the less that they charge you, the less good results you get. So I've had places that charge you like $5, $10, and I've gotten maybe like 1, 2, or 0 people getting the book from those. So yeah, it really is. Seems like you get what you pay for, kind of thing.
So, all right. Well, moving from the world of publishing and all the work that we do, when you have that rare free moment after work and all the other stuff you do in the books, what do you do for fun?
Usually I play Hunt Showdown with friends, which if you know what that's like, you may wonder why I do that for fun, because the game is extremely competitive and requires a lot of perfect execution and focus and resistance to frustration. But I don't know. I guess it's something about my personality. That's kind of my outlet for my competitive nature, which I'm very competitive. And you don't really get much of you don't get to compete much when you're writing. Writing is a different thing. It's mostly about it's just about sitting there and typing words and playing super competitive video games just feels like a completely different thing to my brain.
All right. Well, getting into our wrap up here, what do you think is holding us back, at least as independent authors, the most in the author space? What do you think might be impeding us from competing with the big guys?
Based off what I've seen and the complaints that I've heard, I would say the two things are probably not having cover art that looks to your average book reader as being as professional as traditional published books, or as indie authors who have paid for good quality covers. And then the other thing I think is just having a lot of spelling errors in your book. So basically not getting proofread good enough.
Getting good editing is priceless.
Yeah. Good editing in general. But I think what readers really notice is the spelling errors. So they won't notice as much the difference between a really, really tight plot and then a plot that's, a bit loose and maybe has some things that could have been cut. That won't be as obvious to them as spelling errors will be.
So I'm a big advocate for making sure you've got a good editor. But I feel my voice alone is inadequate for letting people know this. So tell us why you think getting a good edit is important on your book.
I mean, it's important just from the simple fact of having a second pair of eyes on it and someone who is not so close to the story. So the big problem you have as the writer is you will try to come up with a really good story.
Mm-hmm.
And, the more you do it, the better you get at it. But you will miss the parts that either aren't good or that don't make sense or that just are okay, but actually could be better with a few changes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the kind of thing that your editor will almost always, immediately see and point out to you and say, hey, here's the things, we can actually, you know, we can change this character's arc to this, and then that will, you know, give him a much stronger ending. Uh, we can actually just cut out the whole beginning and have the book start a chapter later,
Mm-hmm.
and that will make the beginning much more exciting because you don't actually need this chapter you wrote. We can remove this character because their plot actually goes nowhere and it doesn't really have much effect on the other characters.
Oh, but they're my favorite.
Yeah, yeah. Funny thing for me is I don't know what it is. I don't really like if you can convince me that like an aspect of my story really just isn't helping at all. I don't
Mm-hmm.
really feel bad about cutting it. I usually feel good actually. I'm like, oh, this if this actually makes the book better, I'm happy to take it out.
So I know this is probably going to annoy some people, but it does come up on occasion. How do you feel about drama in the author space? We seem to be part of a circle of independent authors that kind of span between YouTube and YouTube Minds and Twitter. How do you feel about drama that comes up in these spaces?
I mean, drama is going to happen wherever you go. I generally would prefer to, and I try to avoid it as much as I can. I think I end up in the middle of it, kind of just because I moderate several servers with a lot of people in them, and
You are a busy guy.
I guess, yeah. As far as like servers and Gilded goes and stuff, yeah, I'm in a lot, and so I it happens. I generally try to deal with it like as mature as possible, and you know when you have things go bad and people have to be removed, they're going to be upset. They're going to say things about you, and generally the best thing to do, I think, is to just let it go, not say anything, move
Mm-hmm.
on. So
Well, in a sense, we're all kind of in the same little bubble. We're all going to have our conflicts. So it can be good to just let things go, let things reconcile, and hopefully have a better start later. Well, we're
yeah.
almost at the end of our 2 hours. So, how about you tell everybody where they can reach you and where they can find your work?
Yeah. So the place you can find my work is on Amazon. If you search my name, Timo Burnham.
And I'll put a link in the description for you as well.
Yeah, or if you click the link, you can find my books. You can, if you want to, you can follow me on Amazon. I think you should get an email like if I release a new book from
Mm-hmm.
them if you're following me. I'm not sure if it always works, but that's the idea. You can also follow me on Twitter, Timo Burnham there. You can follow me on Minds, Timo Burnham, same thing. I do actually have my own website, timoburnham.com. It is in the process of being built, but you can go there if you want to go see it. Go see a partially built website.
I'm right there with you, learning Java to do my own. Anybody you'd like to shout out before we're done?
Uh, I will shout out my editor, Danica. Um, she helps me a lot with my book. I am a not a great at remembering all the rules of English with like grammar and certain spellings and punctuation.
Mm-hmm.
And she is really, really good at that stuff. So she helps me a lot in the editing process. She helps me also, with all the other things, plot, characters, making sure there's no inconsistencies, all that stuff. So shout out to her. And if anyone's looking for a very affordable but very professional editor who's easy to work with, definitely check her out as well.
All right. Well, I am T. Alex Ratcliffe. I am your host. I hope to bring you more book reviews and more interviews with the authors of said books. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to the chat. You guys have given us some great questions and, of course, some wonderful entertainment. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us and wish you all good luck.